exaggerating that at 2 years old, I would have a camera in my hands, and she actually had the photographic proof to prove it. And little did I know that the actions of my parents would set in motion something that I would find as a career and a passion that I've pursued my entire life. In June of '85, my grandmother had mortgaged her house, and she had provided me with the best camera equipment money could buy at the time, and gave me a plane ticket to London, and told me to send her a postcard and sent me on my way. I had never been to Europe before. I was by myself, and I was having the time of my life. That same time that I was over in London, I was at the hotel pub, and on the news it was being broadcast on every station that Rock Hudson was incredibly sick. They had pictures of him very sunken in, his speech was incoherent, and the announcers had said that he was infected with something called AIDS. They didn't know it at the time that gay men were just one of the first groups this would show up in, and the media had said that this was something that would only be impacting gay men, and that not only as a gay man that I was at risk for getting it, but I was also at risk for transmitting it to everyone around me. The media did not portray a very compassionate picture of AIDS at the time, and those images were the first information that was brought out to the general public about HIV and AIDS, and naturally there was a panic that ensued with it. I didn't pay any attention at the time. I mean, I was 21. I was in London. I was still drinking and using at the time, so it just was not an important point of my life. But I kept it in the background because the media was paying more and more attention to it, that this was something that was going to impact all of us. After that trip to London, I did manage to get sober. And at the urging of my doctor, I had an HIV test. And in 1987, they didn't have the same resources or the same turnaround time that they do right now. So after taking blood and waiting 7 agonizing days, I would come to find out that I was indeed negative.
And my dad was diabetic.
But I would still have to be smart. I would have to use a condom. I would have to ask questions. I would have to take responsibility for my life. A number of my friends, after receiving their HIV tests, were given the information that they were positive. And throughout the course of the next few years, I watched a number of them die when they had acquired full-blown AIDS and the diseases that follow with it. Prior to them passing on, they tolerated a number of my questions, my intolerable inquisitions into their health and everything that was going on with HIV and AIDS, because I wanted to know. It was the responsible thing I needed to do. And to this day, I'm forever grateful for their tolerating everything that I had put them through. One of the things that they had shared with me, and it was a pretty much unanimous thought on their part, was that they were worried because as the disease had progressed and medications at the time did not have the impact that they do today, that they were worried that they would die alone and unloved. Their friends, their family, boyfriends and girlfriends would not be able to watch them waste away, and they would leave them to die. While a lot of them have passed away, none of them have died alone. Even if I did nothing more than sit with them and hold them until they had passed away, that was very least a human life deserves. It was the very least I could do for a friend. During those years, the entertainment industry came into play as far as portraying a different face for HIV and AIDS to correct the message that was given out by broadcast journalism, and they started to paint a very compassionate and understanding picture. Back in the 80s, one of the shows that had a full-blown 30 minutes devoted to HIV and AIDS was Designing Women. And I know I'm probably the only person here that remembers that show. But they had an entire episode devoted to it that left me sobbing because I had related to it so well. Golden Girls came after that with Poor Rosen Island, and this was back in the 80s, so this was really a revolutionary theme for a show. Poor Rosen Island was suffering the wait time turnaround for her AIDS results because she had been exposed to a needle prick by an HIV positive patient. And I didn't know it at the time, but looking back in hindsight, these shows put out a message that nobody really understood to start the turnaround for compassion and understanding with HIV and AIDS. Very shortly after the death of Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor would join a group of scientists to form AMFAR, which is one of the leading AIDS research organizations. And her actions would move mountains to eradicate the memory of a cruel betrayal and condemnation of those that have HIV and AIDS. Okay, so moving forward to 1998, I'm still sober. I'm heading back to London for the 4th time in my life. I was assigned to cover the first anniversary of Princess Di's death. And my responsibility was to get whatever shots I could that counted, send them back to my editor, and I would have the rest of the day free. I had a contact over there, and I managed to get the shots that I needed. And the first day, and I ended up having the rest of the week off, where I would come to meet my partner that would spend the next 12 years with me. I didn't know until about 5 minutes after I met Richard that he was HIV positive, because that was information he let off with. He was very forthcoming with his HIV status. I knew that he was HIV positive before I even knew how many brothers and sisters he had. And that was something that really struck me, because all of the years that I had been exposed to any information or people regarding HIV and AIDS, they had always talked about their diagnosis in hushed whispers, in quiet conversations. Nobody was as forthcoming as Richard was.
My mother is
I didn't have to ask Richard any questions about HIV or AIDS, because he was always volunteering information.
That's my mom's madre. That's what we
He would tolerate countless number of questions from me. He was one of the first 1,000 people that were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS, and he was a very staunch educator for anyone that would listen. And I attended almost 200 different conferences, where in the course of 60 minutes, he would take everybody's preconceived notions of HIV and AIDS and throw them out the window, and replace them with compassion and understanding. He also had a number of conversations in our own home. I would come home from work to find somebody in our living room that I had no idea who it was, but I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was going on. Richard was passing along the message to somebody that needed it. And this was a pivotal point in my life, because the face of AIDS now had a new face. It was compassion and understanding and information. There's still so much people don't know about AIDS, and most were afraid to ask at that time. And to this day, unfortunately, sometimes that's still the case. People were afraid to ask the tough questions or harbor a thought around HIV in their own lives. They didn't want to get an HIV test for fear of knowing that they were positive and how that would impact them. They didn't get an HIV test because they were married or in a committed relationship, completely discounting the fact that their partner might not be so monogamous. Or they were straight, therefore they felt they had no risk of exposure. Sadly, some people still believe this to this day. I can add to the list all day long, but the point that I want to make is this. The preconceived notions around HIV and AIDS are what will ultimately end up killing people. This was one of the lessons I learned while Richard was my partner, up until the day he died at the hands of a drunk driver. And while the face of HIV and AIDS that I had come to grow in love was gone, the message he shared with countless people throughout the course of his life lived on. Make no mistake about it, HIV and AIDS has many faces for people since it first came to be. It might resemble somebody you've seen on television. It might be the face of a friend or family member. If